after over a year since he last fought and captured the UFC light heavyweight belt at UFC 275. Jiri Prochazka makes his long-awaited return after a gruesome shoulder injury 20 pay-per-views later at UFC 295. But rather than fighting the person that captured the title in his absence, or a contender that is due for a title shot soon, or even a rematch against the person he took the title from, instead, he finds himself against an unfamiliar foe with a plan for revenge. Enter Alex Pereira, the former UFC middleweight champion who burst through the ranks to capture the title over longtime rival Israel Adesanya. After losing the belt in a rematch, he continued a new story arc to avenge his training partner Glover Teixeira. He then made his light heavyweight debut at UFC 291, where he edged out a victory over top contender and former champion Jan Blachowicz. This put him in a position for a title shot against champion Jamal Hill, who retired Glover Teixeira earlier in the year. And yet somehow, even after Jamal Hill got injured and vacated the title, Alex Pereira still has another chance to avenge Glover against the first person that took the title away from him. In this video, we're going to go over the attributes and striking data of both Alex Pereira and Jiri Prochazka, and try to tell a story on how this fight will play out. Let's start with an overview of their characteristics. Alex Pereira is listed at 6'4" inches tall with a 79-inch reach. Alex is an orthodox stance fighter with a strike accuracy of 62% and a strike defense of 51%. Additionally, he lands his strikes at a rate of 5.11 strikes per minute and absorbs strikes at a rate of 3.7 strikes per minute. Jiri Prochazka, on the other hand, is listed at 6'3" inches tall with an 80-inch reach, although I think he's probably closer to 6'5" inches tall. Like Alex, he's mostly an orthodox stance fighter, but has a lower strike accuracy standing at around 55% and a lower strike defense standing at around 40%. He lands his strikes at a rate of 5.77 strikes per minute and absorbs them at a rate of 5.4 strikes per minute. So at a glance, Alex Pereira seems to edge out Jiri Prochazka in almost all ways except strike output. But these numbers don't actually tell the full story. To find out more, we have to go over their significant strike distributions and strike accuracies and examine them more closely. But before we get into their fight stats, I would like to address the elephant in the room. Jiri Prochazka only has 3 fights in the UFC, and one of them is a title fight against Glover Teixeira. So rather than relying on just 3 fights in the UFC for data, I decided to rewatch Jiri's last 3 fights in Rizin, against CB Dollaway, Fabio Maldonado, and King Mo, and manually collect the striking data from those fights and input them into the graphs. Keep in mind that these fights happened in a ring rather than a cage, so there will be limitations on this data. With that being said, moving over to the strike distribution Sunburst charts, we see something like this. Starting with Jiri Prochazka's significant strike distribution, we see that Jiri's main target is to strike to the head, and lands at a rate of 55%. He usually does this by using his range to set up a jab, which leads to a power hand or a combo. What I think is most surprising from Jiri is that his offense is so centered on one target that through these 6 fights, he's only thrown a total of 5 leg kicks. Now there's a variety of reasons to explain this, but the reason that I'll offer up is due to his unorthodox fighting stance. Jiri's fighting stance is focused on staying heavy on the lead leg, which doesn't allow him to throw leg kicks as fast like a traditional kickboxer would. If we look over at Alex Pereira's significant strike distribution, we see something a bit more balanced. Pereira's main objective in his fights is still to strike to the head, and lands at a rate of 47%. He does this using the basics, whether that be using his jabs, his hooks, or his crosses. But rather than making the head the sole objective like Jiri Prochazka, Alex Pereira also likes to mix in his body shots and his leg kicks, and does so very accurately. And if we look further to analyze his strike target proportion in each of his fights in the UFC, we actually see that Pereira's objective changes a lot depending on the opponent. For example, you can see that in the Bruno Silva fight, Alex landed most of his strikes to the head since he was fighting against a southpaw, and couldn't throw switch kicks effectively. Whereas in his second fight with Izzy, Alex was mainly throwing a lot of leg kicks to take out Izzy's movement. This shows that Alex Pereira actually has a great ability to adapt his striking depending on his opponent. Going over to Jiri Prochazka's strike proportion per fight, we see something very different. You actually see that in Jiri's fights, the strike target proportion doesn't really change at all. His main objective will and always will be to strike to the head, and throw a minimal amount of leg kicks or body shots for that matter. And as I mentioned earlier, I believe that this is mainly due to Jiri's style and unorthodox stance. So we can start piecing up a little bit of a striking story on how this fight would go, but I think we'll get a clearer picture if we also analyze both of their strike defenses per target. To do this, we'll go back to the strike defense bar charts. If we look over at Alex Pereira's strike defense per target, we actually see that Pereira has a decent head strike defense of 60%. To the body, it's less so at 39%, and even less so to the leg at 18%. But if we're comparing him to a fight with Jiri Prochazka, we can almost ignore the strike defense to the leg since Jiri's style doesn't revolve around throwing too many leg kicks. If we move over to looking at Jiri's strike defense bar charts, we see that Jiri Prochazka's strike defense is actually worse than Alex Pereira in every category. He's not only received more strikes to the head, but he's also received them at a more accurate rate than Alex Pereira. There's actually a few reasons to explain this, but I think the most important reason is surprisingly the fact that I think Jiri actually enjoys staying aggressive and in action in his fights. He's kind of embraced this masochistic style of fighting, where it seems he's perfectly okay with getting hit and accepts it as a reality. You actually see this in particular in his fights against Volkan Ozdemir and Dominic Reyes. In these fights, he was getting tagged quite a bit on the feet early on, embracing their punishment, and then knocking them out in brutal fashion. And more statistically, you see this when you look at the head strike differential line chart for each of his fights. You see that in a majority of his fights, Jiri Prochazka gets hit quite often, but also just as equally is able to match his opponent's strikes throughout the fight. Comparing this with Alex Pereira and putting it at scale, we see that Pereira's head strike differential is actually pretty consistent throughout each of his fights. Even in his 5 rounds with Israel Adesanya, he still received less than half of what Jiri did in 5 rounds with Glover Teixeira. So with all that information out of the way, how do I think this fight will go? I think since both fighters are primarily strikers, it will start and remain standing. Alex Pereira will try and maintain his distance to throw his outside leg kicks to Jiri's heavy lead leg. Jiri Prochazka will absorb those leg kicks and keep putting pressure on Alex with his pawing jab. Eventually, Jiri will catch on to Alex and counter some of Alex's kicks with his power hand. And as Jiri closes the distance, they'll go into some of the more interesting striking exchanges that I think everyone is looking forward to. And as for a prediction, I have none. I think the main key for Alex Pereira to win this fight is to maintain his distance and utilize his outside leg kick to take out Jiri's movement early. Kind of like CB Dollaway tried to do in his fight with Jiri and Rizin. Then eventually, after doing enough damage to the leg, Alex can get Jiri backing up against the fence. Combine that with his jabs and hooks, and I can see him finishing Jiri before the final horn. On the other hand, Jiri Prochazka's main way to winning this fight is to constantly apply pressure on Alex Pereira and not allow him to throw any leg kicks at all. He has to embrace his Terminator-like fighting style and make the fight ugly. He might have to rely a lot on his chin and his head movement to take the massive jabs, crosses, and hooks from Alex. He's shown that he can take a lot of punishment from fighters already in his weight class, so showing he can also take it from Alex and deal bigger shots afterwards will be his way to win this fight. And if he can show that, then I can also see him finishing Alex by KO or TKO. I'm really excited to see this fight not only because it'll be a cool display of striking from these fighters, but because it's such a big clash of styles. On one hand, you have this freak of nature and kickboxing champion that adapts his striking variety a lot depending on the opponent. And the other guy is this long, stocky, aggressive fighter that relies a lot on his chin and embracing the ugly parts of a mixed martial arts fight. It's going to be an interesting matchup, and I'm looking forward to it next week. Any additional graphs that you see on screen right now will be available on the Instagram page. If you like the content, consider subscribing, liking and sharing the video, and leave a comment down below for discussion or video suggestions. Last but not least, please be respectful in the comment section. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.